Welcome back everyone to Random Thoughts, coming to you today with another deck that took me from bronze to diamond in Runestrike. This time we're talking about Zecon. So whether you want to bet your soul against a fiddle of gold or you think you can dance with the devil in the pale moonlight, let's take a look at this demon list. Zecon has actually been a relatively oft-maligned champion as of late, primarily due to the recent champion rework, and we'll talk about that. This deck was inspired because I did actually try to put in a lot of effort working with his new A1 that we're going to talk about momentarily. Eventually, I realized, and honestly kind of quickly, that it was going to be very difficult in the current environment to find success with it. I think there's something there, but right now, I just haven't quite stumbled on it yet. So instead, enter Azrael. For those of you who have listened to any of the streams, you probably heard me mention that I really enjoy the movie Dogma by Kevin Smith. You may have heard of it. There were a lot of things that went on when that movie came out. And one of the characters in that movie is that guy, Azrael. Not too many spoilers, but there's definitely fun to be had in that movie. So let's talk about the champion now that you have a little bit of the background for where the deck name came from. The aforementioned A1 that was changed, Betrayal, now adds a torture to your enemy's hand. Quick cutaway. What's a torture, you may ask? Well, it's over there on screen now. Torture is your champion takes 1 damage when you play it. The keep is your champion takes 1 damage. A kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Very thematic for a champion that's Chaos Shadow and is featuring a ton of demons. Very much leans into it. Ultimately, this power, despite my efforts, was not really working out. I ended up shifting away from it, leaning into the more Halloween season appropriate, or appropriately Halloween-y season, something like that. Neither of those sentences work, but you get where I'm going with it. Point is that the torture didn't quite play out. Maybe it'll come up. But let's jump back and take a look at the other blood abilities. So really where this deck starts to get the engine running is with False Hope. False Hope is target enemy minion, doubles its attack, but dies at end of turn. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, sometimes you can just soak the hit. If it's early on in the game or even late in the game and your opponent plays something like, I don't know, Owl Familiar. Something with a low attack, you can soak the hit. You don't really care, but that thing has to go. You can't risk your opponent drawing a ton of cards. All right, well, False Hope it. Not the ideal way to deal with things. But if you take a quick peek over there, in fact, maybe not too far away, things like Serve the Shadow come into play, and we'll rehash this when we get there. But fact of the matter is that doubling something and then corrupting it is enormously powerful. It could force a 2-for-1. It could close the game if your opponent can't play another minion at the time in order to just soak the hit. Maybe it ultimately ends up freeing up one of your other minions because they only had 1 left and they needed a block. And there's a bunch of scenarios. It's definitely very effective and is pretty strong, essentially hard removal. Next up is Demon Flame, which also sometimes will function as hard removal because it can just off something by giving it -4/-4, or of course setting it up for combat. You probably noticed the Iron Bowl over there. Obviously pairs pretty well. However, it also has a secondary effect where if the minion that it's targeted is a demon, it instead gets +4/+4. So you could turn a medium-sized demon into an enormous threat with this deck. It's entirely possible. And there are a few demons here and other ones that could be included as well. Notably, it also says target minion because obviously the intent is you could nuke your opponent's guy or buff yours. However, there are of course some edge case scenarios where you go, you know what? I need to get my own minion off of the board. Have at it. There are weird times where you might have, oh, I have multiple undead on the board. Some are unblocked, some are not, or I need to kill something that's blocking or whatever, and you happen to have a Bone Knight that hasn't been resurrected yet. All right, well, Demon Flame your own dude and buff your team. These are the weird plays that you can make that Demon Flame enables. So that's a little bit about the champion. Let's jump into the actual cards. So let's talk about the actual list. This is a heavier essence requirement than I typically have for the decks that I've been showcasing. Part of that is my collection has just grown. I have access to more cards. The other part is I tried really hard to make Zecon's A1 work and a number of other iterations, and it just wasn't working. And I broke down and had to craft some of these cards. Really, the turning point was I happened to open Blight of Retribution, which we'll talk about later, and say, all right, that sounds like a sign. We're going to shift gears, and we're going to try and make this demon-themed build come together. Unfortunately, I don't know that the list really works if you try and make it budget. I think you need the higher end cards, at least for this ituration, and you probably need even more. So that whole section that I usually have about substitutions, we're going to have some thoughts. But anyway, as the cards that are here, Dustbolt is a one of here. I found that I was having a little bit of difficulty early in the game. It provides a little bit of healing. It's not an enormous amount, but it allows you to remove things that you might not otherwise be able to. You can very much fall behind with this deck, and while you do feature Meteor Storm at the top end, there's not a whole lot in the current iteration to help claw you back into the game unless your opponent plays into an enormous Serve the Shadow and you just blow them out, that kind of thing. Otherwise, once you start losing your footing and you're on the back foot, it's a very easy slide backwards into a loss. So trying to make sure that you're pressuring, applying pressure, and continuing to advance your board is important. And Dustbolt fits in on those oddball turns where you can just go, all right, I have a spare mana, we'll be able to Sickle Stalker that thing now, whereas I couldn't before. Does it have to be there? Probably not. It would likely get cut for some of those other legendary cards that I was referring to. Next up, of course, is Crazed Alchemist. We've talked about this a million times. Don't leave home without it. That's all I'm going to say. It's just that strong. It's that important. In this deck, though, maybe that's not all I'm going to say. I will add that you can also start to run out of cards and run out of gas. So you may want to hold on to it a little bit longer, depending on how the game is playing out. If you have it on 2, great. Run it out there, smooth out your draws. If you get it to the mid to late game, it gets a little dicey because of the way your blood abilities work. They're kind of on the higher end. It's not uncommon that you want to activate Demon Flame, but the problem is taking 4 and only being able to draw 2 cards off of it feels bad. It's still fine, but you have to do a little bit more dancing. You got to be a little more conscious of your blood usage compared to Crazed Alchemist and when it happens. Next up is Combust. One of the challenges I found with this deck is that you do sometimes feel as though you have a mitt full of answers and not enough threats, but it's just a little clunky. That being said, Combust, as well as its counterpart in Annihilate, are super important and very powerful removal cards. There's just a lot of things that it's much easier to just go, yeah, kill that thing, than it is trying to piece together damage here, damage there, combat damage, whatever, or I just soak a bunch of hits until I can get there. Combust answers a lot of things cleanly. However, as mentioned before when we were talking about A2, Serve the Shadow can very much be essentially targeted removal, and often will of course generate a 2-for-1 as your opponent doesn't want to just get tagged in the face by whatever big thing they played, or the often hilarious scenario of playing Serve the Shadow on your opponent's Iron Bull. If you really hate Iron Bull, running Serve the Shadow is a powerful deterrent because your opponent is going to be very unhappy when they run it out there with a board that it can eat, because it'll then just eat up their board and punch them in the face. Oh, and by the way, it's going to die because we hit it with A2. Serve the Shadow is indispensable and one of the reasons that this deck even works. Next up is Desperate Charge. As mentioned, we had some difficulty sometimes closing games out, and this is a relic of other versions of the build just as I was going through and iterating upon it. There were Viking Longship raids. There were a number of other cards that leaned into a more aggressive front, but ultimately, whether you're getting stuff off of Nightmare, you're just playing Blitz minions such as Sickle Stalker, or you have other bodies, if you have 2 minions on the board, this represents 8 damage. If you have 3, it's 12 damage. That's a lot. And ultimately, at the end of the game when this is going to get played, you're typically going to have minions that are probably going to get removed. Your opponent's going to be playing their sweepers. They already have tools, whatever. You could just close the game out and go, well, if you're going to kill my stuff, it doesn't matter. I've done an enormous amount of damage. I'm going to win through champion punching. I could see this getting cut in this particular iteration. One, I had Crypt of Bones in here, which it obviously plays much better with, a number of different things. it's kind of a relic, like I said. Sickle Stalker needs no introduction. Efficient removal, great body as far as what its purpose is, the usual spiel. Next up is Tomb Viper. I had a much more undead-leaning theme. Again, the previous Crypt Bones, the Bone Knights, which we'll talk about momentarily. This is an acceptable 4-drop, but really this thing kind of needs to find another place to live. We need a replacement for this. It's okay. It'll get you by. Next up is Annihilate. Annihilate, I mentioned previously when we were talking about Combust. It's weird. Annihilate is fantastic. Like, the times when you need an Annihilate, it's kind of the only thing that will answer what your problem is. But Annihilate still kind of sucks because it costs 5. It's just this awkward thing. But at the end of the day, if you need to finish off or remove that 10-drop, you just got to remove that 10-drop. And Annihilate does it very cleanly. Next up is Bone Knight, which again, similar to other cards mentioned, is a relic of earlier iterations of the deck. The difference here is I think Bone Knight can justify its place simply by virtue of being Resurrect. No, the body's not a whole lot to write home about. It's going to die to a stiff breeze. It's not pushing a ton of damage, but the Resurrect is very relevant and can complicate your opponent's ability to do much of anything. So Bone Knight may end up staying even if we cut all of the other undead. Spoiler, there's at least one other undead that's going to stay in the deck. Iron Bull, we'll put that in the Sickle Stalker category. It's just pretty good. So the Nightmare is a one of, and to be honest, I kind of want more, and I think that the whole removal suite kind of needs to get reworked. We do actually have a fair amount of targeted removal between Combust, Annihilate, Serve the Shadow, Nightmare here that you're seeing, the Blitz minions, all kinds of stuff where you can just go, yeah, get that guy out of here. That's before we even talk about the fact that you could False Hope a minion without Serve the Shadow, or just A3 things out of the way. This is intended to be a very board control-y control deck, and we'll talk about that when I do overall thoughts. But Nightmare is really strong. Obviously, you're going to be trying to set it up so that you can conjure. It comes down early enough that if you can play it on curve, you're killing just about anything that's in the way, and even late in the game, you could end up finishing something off with it and getting the conjure. So I really like it. I kind of want to squeeze another copy in. When I was mentioning the other undead that is going to stay in the deck, it's Plague Lord. Our cockroach friend here, every time I look at it, I think of Men in Black. But our flying undead demon here is just impressive all around. It's a threat, it's a board clear, it's evasive, and the important part is, while I've mentioned on many occasions the flight often feels like a liability, a drawback, the fact of the matter here is that it's still going to interact with the board in a meaningful way, and given that the vast majority of our minions are baseline, either undead, demons, or both, guess what? We get to dodge this effect. So clearly you're going to be running this. By the way, if you're ever able to A3 it, it's a pretty sizable threat that your opponent's not going to be happy to deal with. Next up is Blight of Retribution, which I mentioned earlier is what kind of pushed me to go this way. Blight is fantastic. The main reason I really wanted it was for the A1 build, because when you put Tortures in their hand, and this is a play that still comes up in this, it's going to cost them 3 life. Either they hold on to it and end up taking damage until they can remove the Blight, which is unsurprisingly very difficult because of the Veil and the sizable body, or they take 3 damage because you're going to put Tortures in their hands, and probably more than one depending on the board state and the game state. The Blight is fantastic. I love picking it up off of Nightmare or other effects. I wouldn't leave home without it. Next up is Nemain, which is one of the legendaries that, while it doesn't fit the whole demon theme directly, the fact of the matter is that it works unsurprisingly, but supremely well with A2. You really just want to load up on corruption effects or corrupted effects. And if there are any future ones, they definitely want to get included in here. I mean, it'll depend on the exact effect, but any corruption effects you can add to this deck, I don't have Force Mutiny, otherwise that would be in here as well, are spectacular because you could ensure that whatever it is going to die. Nemain becomes an Annihilate with a body attached, essentially, later, once she's online, later in the game or even on turn 6, because you just False Hope and you plop Nemain and you go, all right, not only am I removing that guy, I have a body, and it's going to corrupt something else. You're going to have to find a way out of hand or position your board and just leave Nemain alone to not interact with it. This is another one that just, I feel like it's necessary, unfortunately. Next up is Doom Knight. I actually crafted this relatively late as I was making the push to Diamond, and I do like it. It's costly, but there are decks such as the Dawn A3 build that has kind of fallen off the radar to some extent. I guess people are tired of playing it or whatever, that it will mess with. It's a solid body. It has a relevant effect. It isn't always going to work out, but it's been pretty strong for me. It's just a powerful card, and that's kind of where the deck is going, is that it just wants to drop powerful stuff. Notably, it's not a demon. You're not going to have a lot of ways to synergize with the rest of the build, but hopefully you're able to lock your opponent out of the game to some extent, kind of a soft lock with blood, as well as present a sizable threat. And lastly, we have Meteor Storm. Kind of like the Blitzers, this is what it is. You know what you're getting with this. It's an absolute necessity, I feel, in any Chaos deck. This is no exception. So that's all the cards broken down. Let's talk a little bit about changes that could happen to this deck. Now, although we were talking about the fact that there are a bunch of legendaries that could go in this deck, let's talk about a common, and that is Corpse Demon. Corpse Demon is, well, a demon, so it fits on theme, but it also importantly comes down earlier in the game. You don't quite have the ways to do cute things with Morlich and then guarantee that you're going to wipe the board. You have to jump through a little more or a few more hoops, either to buff it up, to make sure that it does something, or just to get it to die at all. You have to make sure it's in front of something. But it's still a demon that could get buffed. It's something that could be included. You could, of course, do something cute, such as combust your own minion. Not really ideal, but it is something to consider because you want to make sure that you're not falling behind, and also it gives you another board clear. While I do try to shy away from legendaries as suggestions, at least this far into this breakdown series, I do want to point out Set. Set is obviously a board reset. I call that out because it goes even beyond board clear, like we were just talking about with Corpse Demon, which may or may not actually clear the board. Set says, yeah, you're going to need Resurrect or something because that stuff is going away. And yours. It's also not a demon, which is, okay, can't have everything. But it is an important card for something that a deck that wants to try and play to the later game. Does it quite fit? Well, I don't actually have the card, but it feels like something I would certainly want to try. We're going to forego a neutral suggestion this time and actually switch back to Shadow. Again, trying to avoid legendaries, but the fact of the matter is that Force Mutiny is legendary. You have a very unique effect, and I keep intending to do a Runestrike Ruminations talking about blood abilities as a whole, and the unique ability here with our Azrael build for Zecon is that you have False Hope. Lean into it. That's what you're doing different from other decks that is so powerful. Now, at the end of the day, any Shadow deck could ultimately play Force Mutiny, and it would be powerful. But this allows you to potentially do something more powerful by ensuring that a specific minion dies, as opposed to, well, maybe the combat math doesn't work out or something like that, or maybe they aren't big enough to, whatever the case may be. We'll make that guy big enough and it's going to kill something, assuming, I guess the other ones don't kill it first, but, you know, that is how some of the things that you have to worry about. But leaning into the corruption idea for this build is both on theme and pretty powerful. So those are some suggestions for the deck. What about the cohesive whole? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's intended to be a slower, more controlling deck. It really controls the board well, but that assumes that your opponent is actually advancing their board. What do I mean by that? Well, if you play against Faith, you play against Ramses, or unfortunately, you play against Ogma, and I'll explain in a second. The first two are probably obvious. They're more solo-oriented decks where their champion is really what's pushing and pouring on the damage. You're going to have a bunch of dead cards. Serve the Shadow is not spectacular when you can't target anything. And obviously a lot of your blood ends up going into A3, just buffing your own team because you can't do anything else. However, Ogma is also somewhat of an issue because the hyper-aggressive decks, which is where Corpse Demon comes in, can run you over. You do have a very clunky curve. I mean, look at this. You can't see because I'm in the way, but we have nothing that costs 0. We have 1 card that costs 1. We have 2 cards that cost 2. We have 4 cards that cost 3, 4 that cost 4, and then it's 5, 6, 7, and 8. And a lot of them are 5-drops. So you could very easily fall into this weird and uncomfortable pattern of I'm only playing 1 card a turn compared to my opponent's 2, and those 2 cards are all sizable enough that I can't simply remove them cleanly. Even if you can, you're going to fall behind on tempo and they'll run you over. The Duskbolt life gain it's not getting it done. That's where things, which wasn't mentioned before, but such as Harvest Souls and other effects, again, more legendaries, that will help push the power level higher so that you can compete with these decks. So on one hand, you have solo decks that are a problem, and on the other hand, you have aggro decks that could be a problem. Where do you shine? Well, against a lot of mid-rangey things, because they are trying to do your game plan in a similar fashion, but you get super efficient and effective removal because it's that thing, it's dead. That thing, not only is it dead, but it's going to kill your other thing. Oh, you have a bunch of stuff, I'll clean your board. Oh, you have targeted removal, that's cute. Blight doesn't care. Like the Honey Badger, the Demon Honey Badger. There's something there, but I didn't really map that one out very well. Point is that you do have things that will be good matchups, but if you're laddering with this, you could certainly line up against a bunch that aren't going to go your way. So just keep that in mind and be ready to change a bunch of the components. But that'll do it for this time. So we're going to jump into some games, but as always, everybody, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and Black Lives Matter.